Okay, so the last lecture was about the pre-dynastic and early dynastic art and architectural kind of benchmarks in Egypt. We talked about Imhotep and the stepped pyramid. So now we're going to get into the Old Kingdom, excuse me, which is part of the dynastic history of ancient Egypt. Okay, so the Old Kingdom starts with Sneferu, Sneferu, and he reigns from 2575 to 2551 BC. He's the first king of the 4th dynasty, and the Old Kingdom ends with the breakup of the 8th dynasty in 2134 BC. The kind of crowning jewel, the standout thing of the Old Kingdom are the Great Pyramids at Giza. Very famous. When you think of Egypt and you think of pyramids, these are the pyramids that you think of. They are the oldest of the 7 wonders of the ancient world. It took around 75 years to build the 3 main pyramids at Giza. And this was also Heliopolis, Helopolis, which was the seat of power for the cult of Ra. Okay, so when I say cult, I don't mean like, oh no, you're in a cult, call your dad, like, you're in trouble. Cult has a different connotation historically. So when I say cult, when I'm talking about ancient Egypt, or when we get to the ancient Greeks or the Roman Empire, the cult refers to the particular sect of the Egyptian religion that is following one particular deity. Okay, so it's kind of like a designation of part of a religion, a denomination, let's say. So like, for example, in contemporary Christianity, you have like Catholics and Baptists and Presbyterians and those kind of things, okay? So within the Egyptian religion, you have cults. So the cult of Ra are the people who are particularly devoted to the sun god Ra. You have, the cult of Osiris would be particularly devoted to Osiris, et cetera, et cetera. So the seat of power, which is called the Heliopolis, Halo meaning sun, right, for Ra is here, is at Giza. And so that's where the high priest of Ra is living, and that's kind of the dominant cult of their religion at the time. So the pyramids are not just a refinement of the stepped pyramid, they're also directly referencing some of the imagery associated with Ra, the sun god, and with the cult of Ra. The sun's rays, the sunbeams that come out of the sun, are considered kind of like a ladder, like the dead king's ladder to ascend after death. And so they're a very important part of the Book of the Dead, and particularly as it pertains to pharaohs and kings and their journey after death. So because of this, the idea of having tombs that are shaped in a triangular form is supposed to be a reference to the sun's rays, and to be this sort of physical embodiment of that shape, of the shape of sunbeams coming down from the sun, to represent this ladder that the god king uses to ascend. And we get this from texts inscribed in the tombs in the pyramids. Okay, so at Giza, we have 3 pyramids: Khufu, Khafre, and Menkaure. And those are the names of the pyramids, and probably pretty easy to guess where the names come from. Those are the names of the pharaohs that are buried within them, right? Okay, so each of the pharaohs buried here has their own pyramid. In this image, left to right, we have Menkaure, Khafre, and then Khufu, and the dates related to them. So Khufu is the largest and the oldest, so when people say the Great Pyramid singular, that's the one that they're talking about. And the emblem of the Heliopolis, of the center for the head of power for the Ra sun god cult, is a pyramid. That's their emblem. That's the symbol of the power of the Heliopolis. And a pyramid in Egyptian is called a bin-bin, B-E-N-B-E-N in English. Um, okay, so, and all of these have their east side facing the sun, so as the sun rises, the east entrance is illuminated, because they're a symbol of the sun, right? Okay, so Himirnu supervised the building of Khufu. We don't have, just because Imhotep was recorded doesn't mean that we have all of these important builders throughout time recorded, but there are a couple of them. These originally, so they're made out of stone, sandstone, and then they were encased in white limestone. So they would have looked quite differently. They would have had smooth white limestone exteriors when they were originally made. It's called ashlar masonry, which is polishing stone blocks with round polishing stones, and then carefully stacking these cut and polished stones so that they look, so they're in successive horizontal rows, or also called courses, right, to build up the sides. So these are the pyramids. Inside each of them, I think I have a slide, let me see. Inside each of them, there's a very complex interior, which kind of makes sense because just thinking back to the simple mastaba, and then also in the stepped pyramid and the funerary complex of Djoser at Saqqara, we have these very complex networks of tunnels and shafts and things underneath tombs. So these have rather complicated interiors within the pyramids themselves. So there's an entrance, then there's a passageway that descends, there's a passageway that ascends, there's the queen's chamber, there are ventilation shafts so that the Ka has a way to escape and also come back in. There's a grand gallery with an antechamber, then there's the king's chamber, and there's relieving chambers, okay? And all of these things are designed to be kind of tricky to get to and kind of sneaky. There's well shafts and things, and there's kind of false pathways, right, to keep everything safe, to keep the king's mummified body and the queen and his Ka and all of the things that they've put for his Ka to have for the afterlife safe. Okay, the other super iconic piece of Egypt that comes out of the Old Kingdom and is really kind of iconic over all the dynasties and history of ancient Egypt is the Great Sphinx. This is also at Giza, so this is part of the same complex. It's made out of sandstone. It's built between 2520 and 2492. Most people think that this is Khafre, so one of the pyramids was his, and also the Sphinx. Some scholars dispute that and think it's actually Khufu. Most people think it's Khafre. So this is the oldest known monumental sculpture in Egypt. It's carved into the bedrock. So the base of it is carved into the bedrock below the sand of the desert. So it's carved into the Giza Plateau. Thus, the base of it is kind of a monolith. Remember when we talked about megalithic sculptures and things like that? It's made out of many different pieces of stone, as you can see, but the base of it is one big bedrock piece. It's discovered by archaeologists in the 1870s, and it was called the Great Sphinx until, it wasn't called the Great Sphinx until classical antiquity. So it wasn't called the Great Sphinx until the Greeks came along and made up what a sphinx was, because this wasn't a mythological creature that existed for the ancient Egyptians. So it's actually a misnomer. In the Old Kingdom, there's no mention of it, of the word Sphinx. In the New Kingdom, it's revered in connection with Horus of the horizon, so that kind of transformation of Horus that I talked about in the lecture about gods and goddesses. In modern Egyptian, it is Abu Ahol, so Abu-Alhol, Abu Ahol, which means the terrifying one, or the father of dread. Okay, so in classical Greek, the Sphinx is a beast with a lion's body, a woman's head, and eagle wings, which is why the Great Sphinx gets misgendered a lot in pop culture, Khafre was a dude, not a woman, so this is actually a man's head on a lion body, and it does not have wings. So it's not really a sphinx. Excuse me, but that's what it's been called for so long that that's kind of how we identify it culturally now. The specific purpose is not known. In general, statues and tombs, which we talked about with the mastabas earlier, in ancient Egypt, they were kind of temporary homes for the ka. So you had a statue of yourself that your ka could live within until it's ready to ascend, and then if it wanted to come back to earth, it could reside inside the statue of you. So some scholars think maybe that this was Khafre or maybe Khufu's statue for his ka. So he thought that he just needed a really big one because he was so big and powerful, so he needed this monumental sculpture for his ka to reside in before it ascended and then when it returned to earth. We don't know. That's just a theory. Statues at the time look quite stiff and unnatural. This is to portray the timelessness of the ka, okay? So this is something that we see throughout the Old Kingdom, this style of this very stiff depiction. So this is another statue of Khafre. Most pharaohs have quite a few statues portraying them, so likely this is the same guy as the Sphinx or the terrifying one. So this is a pretty typical statue of a pharaoh from the Old Kingdom. It is carved out of diorite. Diorite is a very hard stone and was used a lot for sculpture in ancient Egypt. It lasted a little better than sandstone in some regards because it was metamorphic instead of sedentary, so it's a harder kind of rock. Notice a few things here. So we have this kind of traditional headdress of the pharaohs of Egypt of the Old Kingdom, this very stylized kind of beard. He's sitting in his throne. It's very stiff. We have symbols of the papyrus flower on the throne. We have him in his traditional dress. His legs are very stiff. His arms are very stiff. He had something in his palm and something in his fist that have been since removed. Probably would have been made out of gold. So this is very intentional, very stylized. He's kind of idealized in terms of his body and face being very symmetrical, strong, muscular, like big shoulders, small waist, very symmetrical face. And the idea of the figure being portrayed so stiff doesn't mean that they didn't have the ability to portray people in a more naturalistic way. It's meant because he's the pharaoh and therefore is a deity, right? The pharaohs become deities. It's supposed to show the timelessness of him as a god king, right? And of the timelessness of his ka. Okay, next we will talk about the Middle Kingdom.